Welcome to Smart Branding, a podcast dedicated to branding, naming, and domain names. I'm Tatiana Bonneau, and with my guests, we try to help you create and grow strong, memorable, and meaningful brands online. I believe time is one of our most precious assets, and so I want to thank you in advance if you decide to spend the next 30 minutes with us. I promise to do my best to make those worth it. Let's go. So today our guest is Michael Solomon. He's one of the top 10 most productive scholars with published research on consumer behavior, fashion psychology, branding, retailing, and marketing research in numerous academic journals. He has written over 30 books on those topics, as well as many featured articles in national and international magazines. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for making the time and welcome, Michael.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your program.
So as always, let's start with a little bit of a background before we dive into we have so many things to talk about with you. I mentioned just before the call that even on our team, we have people who have studied your work at university and they're super excited to hear from you. So I'm going to struggle to not bombard you with questions, but give us a bit of a background. Who's Michael and how did you get to do what you do?
Okay, well, they're probably happier about me than my own students are, but who knows? But anyway, that's always nice to hear. So very, very briefly, I'm currently a marketing professor in the Haub School of Business at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia in the States. I've been a marketing professor both here and in Europe for many, many years. And during that time, I've done a lot of research, as you mentioned, on different aspects of consumer behavior and brand meaning, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of major marketers to help them become more customer-centric, to help them to understand what their brands actually mean to their customers, and that's been some great experiences, and has led me to understand that it almost doesn't matter what industry you're working in. Many of the things that we're going to talk about, I think, are relevant. I know a lot of your listeners are entrepreneurs, and no matter what business you're starting up in, there's one ingredient that's the most essential in your new startup, and that is customers. If you don't have them, you probably don't have much of a business. So that's been my focus during my career. I've written textbooks, as you mentioned, and also trade books, and we might talk about that a bit. And my latest activity is that we recently launched an online course on customer engagement for people who really want to get into it. But that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it.
That's great. And you've been doing that for quite some time, and I'm sure even in the past few years, the things are changing so much. Consumers, customers are changing so much. What is do you find most the biggest changes, and how do they affect business?
Well, if you have 2 or 3 hours, we can get into this.
Yeah, I know.
It's funny. A lot of people assume that COVID really changed our lives, and it did, and it certainly did. But what I like to emphasize is that for the most part, COVID did not cause any of these big changes that we're seeing now. It merely accelerated them because they were already happening, and that's certainly true for consumer behavior. For example. Some people say, well, COVID was the reason that many people turned to online delivery, especially for food. That's not quite true. That was already happening beforehand. People were starting to work from home before COVID. COVID just kind of threw some fuel on the fire. So, I think we have to actually go back further in time to understand some of the really big disruptions that are going on now, and we can get into those. But to answer your question, I think the single biggest and most important development in marketing, and in the last 20, 30 years probably, is the ability of consumers to interact with the brands, what we call Internet 2.0. We're no longer just the passive recipient of whatever the brands want to tell us, but rather we're very much a part of the conversation and often leading the conversation. And that kind of empowerment, that translates into some of the things that we saw, during COVID that we're talking about, where people are, I guess you might say, taking more control over what they buy, where it comes from, how they get it, et cetera. So, we're definitely seeing a much bigger awareness among people, certainly more pronounced among young people, but even old guys like me, where people are kind of waking up. Obviously, we have these huge conversations about equality, both in Europe where you are and here in the States, and, lots of social disruption, et cetera. And that definitely relates to brands. And, so perhaps, again, aggravated by COVID, people's confidence in the ability of institutions to keep them safe, and I'm referring to governments, maybe churches and so on, that has really eroded. And so what we see in some surveys is that many consumers think that companies actually can do more to make the world a better place than governments or other kinds of institutions. So increasingly, people are looking to brands to kind of create, not only, clue them in that there's things that they don't own that perhaps they should, but rather to take the lead in making social changes. Companies like Nike, et cetera, that are doing this. And it's interesting. I was just telling my undergraduate students yesterday, back in the old days, it was kind of an unwritten rule that just like when you're at a cocktail party or something, there are certain topics that are taboo, like politics and religion. We never discuss those. And now today, almost every brand has to have some statement about what it stands for, what it opposes, et cetera. So brands have become very politicized. I think that there are a lot of opportunities for brands to make the world a better place, but it's also a real challenge because people are no longer focusing on the same kinds of brand attributes that they used to. The first question they're going to ask is, what do I know about this brand and what has it done that's good for people? Then they're going to ask, well, does it actually work? So marketers really need to kind of reorder or realign their priorities and the way they introduce brands to people. And that certainly goes for new brands, for startups, et cetera.
Absolutely. I can totally agree with that. And one of my sons is turning 18 this week. And I love looking at kids actually to kind of I know it's not representative because, I only have 4, it's not a huge statistical example, but it's still very interesting as an indication as to, how they buy, what they think. And he can spend hours looking at a brand and what they do, who's the CEO, what do they do, what do they think about all issues that matter to him. And that's something that I didn't, I thought of myself as a very conscious kind of citizen of Earth when I was in his age, but I didn't do any of that. And it's really, for anyone who's going into business, it puts a lot of weight on their shoulders to craft that and to actually have it. It's not just about let's write it and show it to the world. That's what we think. People are actually able to see through it. So it does actually have to be authentic.
Yeah, exactly. And, I always tell people, if you have a story about your brand, the way it was founded, like many big, Apple, Hewlett Packard, they all have what we call founder stories. A lot of entrepreneurs have stories as well. And what I say is, if you have a story, tell it, because that's what people want to hear. You're right that some brands have to think about what is my story and what have I been doing for the last 50 years to be consistent with that story. But the reality is that there's also a lot of brands that have great stories, but don't tell them because they think people don't want to know that. They think people just want to know, what are the chemicals in my shampoo? And that is definitely not the case today. So, that's one of the advantages that a lot of entrepreneurs have over big companies is that they do have that story and they're probably part of that founder story. And that is the kind of thing people just love to as we say in the States, they eat it with a spoon because they just love They love this idea. Oh, these two sisters, couldn't find a gentle enough soap for their babies, so they invented one in their garage. That's the kind of thing that really, really resonates with people today, assuming it's true. Now, don't go making it up, but assuming it's true. Because as you said, I'm sorry, say again.
No, so do you think that will stay as a I wouldn't call it a trend, because it has been now there for quite some time and it doesn't seem to be going away, but do you feel that that's how it will continue to be?
Well, I tend to be a little more skeptical. I've been studying consumers for about 40 years, and I'm I tend to be kind of skeptical about these things, and especially doing a lot of work in fashion psychology. I know that there's almost no such thing as something that's going to be here forever. I think the biggest challenge is going to be the value argument. In other words, a lot of people will tell you, I will always choose the product that's better for the world. Mm-hmm. But what they won't tell you is, I will pay a premium of 10% more or 20% more to get the product that's better for the world. That's where they draw the line. Mm-hmm. And so the argument has to be, in fact, very often these better quality, sustainable products in the long run are actually less expensive. And that's true, and there's a lot of research to show that companies that operate sustainably actually are more profitable. But that's not the story that most of us have. We think, well, I'm going to have to pay extra because that's another benefit that this other competitor doesn't have. And, I think a great place to see this kind of contradiction, you're talking about young people looking at this stuff. On the other hand, you have a lot of young people who are into, for example, fast fashion, H&M, Zara, and all that have really changed the entire fashion industry in a lot of ways. But what they've done is to pump a lot more variety into the marketplace, but also to create a huge amount of waste. And so it's ironic that a lot of these young people who are jumping up and down about chemicals or something, have no problem going to Zara once a week and buying a $10 blouse and then throwing it away the following week. So, there's a disconnect between what we believe to be true and how we gauge our own behavior. And that's the challenge.
Yeah, I know that feeling, or that story. I've seen that. Back to my son, a poor thing. I hope he doesn't listen to that podcast, because then I'm going to be talking about him a bit. But he became, a year or so ago, he became vegan. So that's great. I don't eat meat myself, but I'm not completely vegan. But he started buying things. He had ethical and environmental reasons as well. But he started buying things that supposedly are good for the planet, logically, but then when you start looking into it, but that came from the other part of the world. It didn't just appear here. So even though it's not meat, it doesn't just by default make it eco-friendly. And like you say, there's a lot of that going on, and it's interesting actually to see how will that develop. But also that is partly responsibility, I guess, of the brands themselves to communicate that and use it to their advantage even.
Yes, it is. And, unfortunately, many brands are poisoning the well for the good brands, because, I don't know if you know the term greenwashing, that people are, I mean, by some estimates, up to maybe 90% of environmental claims that companies make are not true or greatly exaggerated. When we look at the extent to which people trust various institutions, advertising is down there with politicians, and you can't get much lower than that. And to a large extent, they brought it on themselves because they do, they exaggerate, or they say things that people want to hear. And people are not stupid. Once they realize that, then they assume everybody is exaggerating. And so the good actors out there have an extra difficult problem, because some of their competitors are not playing very nicely. That may benefit them in the short term, but if they're in business and for the long term, people are going to see through that, and they're going to still gravitate to the brands that, as we say, they walk the walk, not just talk. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's different between somebody, being in it just for the quick gains and somebody planning on building a brand that's going to be there, and you're not going to be ashamed to put your name to it in 10 years time.
Exactly.
You talk about brand personality. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. That's a term that we use to describe the attributes that people attribute or assign to brands. And it sounds crazy. When I say to an audience or to students, if your favorite brand came to life suddenly as a person, who would that person be? Would they be young, old, male, female, et cetera? And people look at me quizzically, that's a product, that's not a person. But then they immediately start to reel off all the things that make that brand would be if it were a person. And so there's it's quite common to use that sort of technique actually in focus groups and so on. But it goes a lot deeper than that, because it reminds us that we do relate to brands in some ways as if they were people. And just like we choose our friends very selectively. Maybe we have people that we love to hate, it's the same thing about brands. And, a lot of research over many years supporting the idea that in many circumstances, people choose brands that are either similar to the way they feel about themselves, or they reflect, more importantly, something about who they want to be down the road. And that's, of course, a huge role that advertising plays, because it presents us with pictures of the possible down the road. Now, it gets dangerous when those promises can never be attained. But for the most part, everybody's life is a work in progress, and we're always reaching toward becoming a better podcaster or a better professor, a better tennis player, a better partner, whatever it is. And so we look to brands to help us to make those connections. And so the most successful brand stories or brands are the ones who have created a strong personality around their brand and who are able to connect that with what people are looking for. How do they do that? Well, sometimes they just write a big check and hire a celebrity to be the voice, to be the face of their brand. But not all brands have the luxury of doing that, of course, especially smaller ones. But you can still create a personality at basically everything you do around your brand. If you're in a bricks and mortar situation, certainly the way your environment is designed, but even on a website and so on, people are always looking for clues about who is this quote person that I'm interacting with. And so again, the brand personality, what I say to people is, take that exercise I asked you about, if your brand came to life. Now do it to your brand, the brand that you're selling. What if your brand came to life, who would it be? And if someone is not able to give me a fairly detailed answer, then I tell them, you have a very big problem, my friend, that we've just discovered. Because if you can't articulate what your brand is and who it is, certainly no one else will be able to.
Absolutely. And I think even as you were talking, I'm sure anybody listening, as you were talking about successful brands that have been that part of their success is that they have a really clear brand personality. I had a few just appear in my head. Like Nike is, and I'm a bit biased because I'm a Nike fan, but that's part of it. It's really like they've really nailed that idea of you feel like that brand represents you in a very personal way, even though there's so many people wearing those products. You still feel that. I feel like sometimes because I do mountain running, and sometimes there are products of other brands that are better suited for whatever need I have. I feel bad buying them. I feel like I'm cheating on somebody. It's crazy, and that's good marketing. That's good brand building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and if the brand doesn't, what I like to say is that people don't buy things because of what they do. They buy them because of what they mean. And the reality is that today, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the stuff that we make works. It's not you're not gonna get it home and it's not gonna, it's gonna explode or something. Yes, there are cases where that happens, but for the most part, and this drives a lot of marketers crazy. Maybe you've probably encountered this. You're working for a brand, you think they're great. You wouldn't be working for them if you didn't. But when you say to consumers, here's 5 brands in this category, including the one you're working on, what's the difference among them? And a lot of people will just say, well, they're all pretty much the same. and that, that assumption, it drives you crazy because your brand is not the same. But it also means that people are not really focusing on whether the brand will work. They're focusing on what kind of person is it going to make me, and and whether it's identifying with a famous athlete like Michael Jordan or something for Nike, or whether it's some other dimension that you're using, expertise or philanthropy, or what a company like Patagonia that's so far out in front in terms of environmental issues and so on. If those issues don't matter to you, then that brand is not a good story for you. But if they do matter to you, and one brand has successfully told the story of how they've been fighting to, reduce waste in textiles or something, that is what, what we call it brand resonance. So something resonates with you. It kind of strikes you to your core. It's not just oh, that's interesting. It's more like, yes, that's who I am, and there's different ways to create that kind of resonance. Sometimes it's aligning with other people who share your passions. So, people are into CrossFit or something like that, where it takes a village, it takes a, group of people to watch each other suffer and wince in pain as they lift barbells and so on. There's different ways that you can do it. Sometimes it's just being current or, embodying what's going on at the moment, like say ride sharing. And so Uber becomes a brand that has a lot of meanings attached to it. And we could go down the line and, talk about other ways to do that. The important thing is, do you do it at all? So there's many ways to do it. Unfortunately, most companies don't try it at all. They're focused more on what they do. Yeah, we have this great widget. It's going to be great. It's going to work for you. Okay, well, yeah, they all going to work for me. But, what do I know about you and how does that connect with my life?
And that brings us to what I mentioned in your introduction. You focus on helping brands become more customer-centric. And I'm oftentimes drawing that parallel with an issue that I have in my field of work, where I help entrepreneurs secure basically the best name and matching domain name for their business. And from the moment people reach out to me or I reach out to people, the big sort of a battle is to get them to realize they have a problem. Like once that's there, it's much easier. So in your case, where we're talking about brands that are potentially not customer centric, you just mentioned a lot of brands, unfortunately, are focusing on like how great their product is and what they're producing and throwing cash at advertising, which I think sometimes can be actually a downside because you get the feeling that it's working, but it's just like because you're throwing cash at it, and it actually would stop as soon as you stop throwing cash at it. But that's another story. So how would an entrepreneur realize that they have a problem and they're not customer centric?
One of the biggest assets that any organization has is one that they tend to overlook, and that is their customer or their users. And of course, the user is someone who's totally on top of what's going on, especially if you're fairly new. Maybe the only users are your relatives or something, but they have some reason for patronizing you, and they are an unbelievable source to tell you what your brand means. In other words, you may think you know what your brand means, and a lot of time, there are a lot of companies that they don't even do any marketing research because they say, well, we've been in business for 40 years. We know what our brand is. But they may not know what it means to customers, and especially to different customers. So what we often see is in different types of people will adopt a brand and modify it for their own purposes. So for example, there are some traditional, let's say, luxury brands that have been kind of co-opted by rap and hip hop stars like Timberland, for example, or Lacoste. And so the ways that people in those markets use the same product may be quite different. Sometimes it's an ironic statement like, yeah, I come from a bad part of town. I could never afford Timberlands, so I'm going to wear them now. So it could be kind of a statement like that. But the point is that what companies have to recognize today is that you don't own your brand anymore. And I tell audiences this all the time. Get over it. You don't own your brand. You co-own your brand. But your customers play a very important role in creating and perpetuating your brand. And often they are the best source of intelligence about what's going right with your brand and what's going wrong. And especially ideas for new offerings, and ironically, this kind of customer closer relationship is much more prevalent in the B2B space, industrial products and so on, than it is for consumer products, that shouldn't be the case. But for example, if you look in certain industries like the chemicals industry, right? 70% of the ideas for new chemical products originated with customers, the customers who are buying these chemicals to use in their, manufacturing, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're actually using the product, you're the one who's going to be first to see where there's it would be much better if you maybe did it a little bit this way. So, to answer your question, I think the first thing you do is know your customer, even if you literally only have one customer. Maybe it's your spouse, but still talk to those people, get them to do, like we talked about before. If if this came to life in the morning and was sitting on your bed when you woke up, who would it be? And you start to get, now that's, nothing scientific about that. It's not very rigorous, but it gives you a sense of what people are taking from your brand. And the failure to consult, what the problem is, and this is really true if you're a startup, the need that you feel to keep adding more customers. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is that what we tend to do is we acquire a customer, whatever it took to do that. Now he or she is on our team. So we check the box and now we go on to the next new person without understanding that the person we've worked so hard to acquire is now an asset that we are ignoring. And so, by some estimates, it can be as much as 7 times more expensive to get a new customer than to keep an old one.
Absolutely.
So I think, a lot of the problems that companies run into is, and understandably, you're on a very limited budget. You have a runway to launch your brand. You want to get as many people to use it as possible. But, if you remember, I don't know if you're familiar with the 80-20 rule in marketing. It's often used, basically a rule of thumb that says 20% of your customers account for 80% of your profits. That's sometimes, it's not always set in stone, 80-20, but it's that kind of proportion you often find. And so it's not, you and I could both be, quote, customers of brand X. But I spend €50 a week on it, and you spend €10 a week on it. Who's the more valuable customer? And so I could go out and try to attract a few more of you that you're each going to pay €10, or I could go back to that €50 a week customer and say, how can I get that up to 70? And also turn them into someone who's going to be my ambassador, who's going to proselytize for me. Because if I found a brand that really resonates with me, I want to share that. I want to share my good fortune, and that's what we have this thing called social media, and virality and so on. That's where that comes into play.
Yeah, I'm writing questions as we speak, and I'm not going to be able to ask them all. But I really love what you said about you don't own your brand, which is definitely, as you said, something that really, really applies nowadays. And it's kind of like whether entrepreneurs realize it or not, it's there and it's happening. And in a way, it can be something that they can absolutely use to their advantage, that conversation and that, in a way, building that brand with your audience and having that communication open at all times. It's something that's really invaluable. But if ignored, it effectively turns into a problem.
Yeah. Well, one of the advantages that small businesses have, everybody likes to say, "Oh, how can I compete against the big guys and all that?" one huge advantage is the ability to pivot very quickly and to come up, if you have reason to believe that, a modification of your current brand would really be worthwhile, you could probably make that happen in a few weeks or something. Whereas Coca-Cola is not, if they say we need a new flavor, it's not going to come out in 2 weeks.
Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned social media just now. So how do you see, obviously, it's been there for some time. There's new platforms coming and going. And I find that a lot of businesses kind of forget the fact that it's a tool. It's not your business and it's not your customer. And I see so many people running around, trying to please algorithms or making sure they whatever, and like literally writing content for the algorithms. And it's like, yeah, but weren't we supposed to be talking to people? Like, what's your experience with that, and how do you feel it should be done right?
Yeah, well, obviously social media totally changed the landscape in terms of how we connect with customers. And it does empower them in the ways we've been talking about, because they can, they're very often a customer's opinion about a product carries a lot more weight than what the company says. But as you say, part of it is just fashion or fads. What's the latest platform? TikTok. Okay, we need to be on there. Oh, okay, we're on there. Check the box. That's probably, I won't say it's a total waste of time, but probably a bit misguided. There are ways to use social media, again, to involve your customers more in the process by asking them not so much for their, to share their opinions with influencers, but sharing their opinions with you, enlisting them to be part of your community, in addition to other communities that might talk about the brand, like influencers and so on. And of course, the first answer, how do I get involved in social media these days? Influencer marketing is what everybody says, and with good reason, because it's been very impactful. But I personally don't think that it's going to last, because I think that just like with greenwashing, there are too many people out there who see an opportunity to make a quick profit, and they're just putting themselves out there. They don't really have the bona fides to do it or anything like that. Plus, they're often being biased by the companies that they review, even though that may, depending on the country, that may be illegal. But what these influencers originally brought to the table was objectivity, and an alternative to the company itself to tell me whether this brand really does what they say. Now, when that objectivity is compromised, because we often assume, or at least I do, that when someone's reviewing a brand, that they probably got a sample of it to review, at least, if not other kind of compensation. And so they don't, in my mind, they don't become any more objective than the company itself. They're working for the company. And that's why, we've seen, I think we're starting to see the beginning of the end, because now a lot of marketers are moving away from the so-called macro influencers, the Kylie Jenners of the world, and trying to locate people who have micro followings of, let's say, 10,000 people or less. And that's become the new target. So you're deliberately looking for people who aren't as popular as the people you found before. When they become more popular, then you have to start over again. Yeah. because they've lost their authenticity. And that is, that's a central paradox in marketing. And take a company like Levi Strauss, for example. I used to do a lot of work with Levi Strauss. Their biggest story, their brand story, is about authenticity and the miners using it. All of these different things. James Dean in the movies in the 50s, motorcycle gangs. But when people start, the paradox of fashion, of what I call it, when other people start to want to buy into that story. So when somebody like me goes out and buys a Harley Davidson motorcycle, then the authenticity of the brand is tarnished. So again, in the quest to add new customers, what they're doing is alienating the base. So by definition, if you're a niche brand, you want to become more mainstream, but if you become more mainstream, you no longer are niche. And so you have to do something else. And it's that continual process of reinventing yourself that companies like Levi Strauss struggle with. Sometimes the way they get around it is they might come up with a sub brand, like, for them, they have a couple of those that they charge more money for, but they're still Levi Strauss, and everybody knows that. So the irony is that your success becomes your challenge.
That's nicely said.
Which is not a bad, it's not the worst problem that you can have. But again, especially if you're in a fashion oriented business, if your brand personality is edgy, and now, housewives in the middle of somewhere are now buying it, or you see 12-year-old white kids wearing rapper clothing or something, you can imagine the look, the original person who created that style is definitely onto something else.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic. What would you say about, because I can't avoid asking the question of naming and the role of naming, and subsequently domains nowadays as part of that, since you obviously have to have your name on the internet. For example, you yourself have your name as your domain, and we spoke briefly about social media and how brands are trying to jump onto the next thing, and in my opinion, or in my experience, a strong brand has to have its own domain, and so its own place on the internet, and then everything else is a tool to drive that audience towards it. What are your thoughts on that? And I'm kind of going to expand on that a bit for personal branding, like in your case, because you do all of those different things, but you have your personal brand, and also for companies.
Well, the name is so much a part of the personality, isn't it? Just like with people, and look, the reality is we often make assumptions about a person just based on their name before we've even met them. So before I met you, I said, "Oh, Tatiana, she must be Russian," right? But you're not, or maybe you were.
I have roots, yeah.
Okay, but so obviously a name is hugely important, because it basically cues our brain to light up and say, "Oh, I'm going to be seeing something that has these characteristics." And so, as you know very well, being in this, better than I, the art of naming is much more complicated than it seems, because that name, well, first of all, you have to live with that name for a really long time, unless you're forced to change it for some reason. But that name itself often is going to convey the desired personality of the product. And that's why many companies are going to use metaphors so heavily. If you think about automobiles, you have the Jaguar and the Mustang, the Barracuda, you have names like that. There are, of course, rules or guidelines for naming, and you know that better than I do about how the name has to be memorable, and et cetera. And so, I would say it's not a trivial thing. And even more importantly, don't have the illusion that you can change it later to a better one, because that is really a problem, right? When a company has to change its name, unless they're doing it deliberately because they were sent, some of the officers went to jail and they're starting a new brand or something. You don't want to be doing that. And even, we can see what happens even with the most established brands when they make changes that people aren't ready for. The famous Coca-Cola fiasco back in the 1980s. You're too young to even remember that, probably, but Coca-Cola violated people's expectations about what the brand should be, what it should taste like. And it's a big problem for them, and so any brand that does that, I think sometimes your brand, sometimes you can modify it later if you're lucky. So, for example, Kentucky Fried Chicken is now only known as KFC because the word fried is no longer a positive for many people. It connotes dietary challenges, et cetera. So they're able to shorten it to KFC. But most brands don't have that kind of luxury. So I would say think very carefully and don't just do it casually.
Definitely agree with that. And that's kind of the advice I try to give to people when it comes to naming, like regardless of who they work with, it's just don't take it lightly. And that idea of, we can just change it later. You can't always, and it's always risky and expensive. So I think it's the first thing at least to do is take it seriously.
And it's also risky, I think, to be very specific about what you're making in your brand. If you call it Tatiana's screwdrivers, then you're confined to selling screwdrivers your entire life. But home tools that make your life easier, some name that connotes that, then you have the ability to expand your branding umbrella and start to make other things as well without confusing people.
Definitely. That's funny. We're going to publish it today. I think the girls on the team are working on that, but we did, and that's leading to my next question about artificial intelligence. So I'm sure you've had some play around with ChatGPT and all the rest of it. We asked it to write a poem about domain names, and the example of the poem that it wrote was about a guy similar to your example about screwdrivers, but it was about a guy who launched a business that had chocolates in its name and then expanded later on, and it was limited by the chocolate in the name. So that's definitely something that I see oftentimes as well in my personal experience with entrepreneurs, where you don't always know where that brand, where that business will develop. So it's good to keep an open mind and not limit yourself to a category or to a service or market, geographically speaking. So that definitely something. What are your thoughts on artificial intelligence? How has it affected, marketing and branding, I would say, and where do you see it? Like everybody is, panicking about it's going to replace us. It's going to, how do you see it?
Well, and again, this is not new. This has been in the works for a while, but is getting a lot more publicity now. And obviously the capabilities are improving quite dramatically from, say, 10 years ago. I had the occasion at one time on a project to work with IBM's AI system, Watson, and it was very impressive, but it doesn't do what these people do today. I think that the problem is one of credibility, where it gets to the point where when I see some copy, I'm going to be wondering if a machine wrote that. In the same way as, unfortunately, if a student hands in a paper now, I have to assume that they used AI to write it, which is a big problem for us right now. But, I think what it's going to do, I think one of the biggest issues in our business is automation and replacing jobs. And I think it will do that. It's already started to do that. Lower level jobs now, you can put a good spin on that and say it frees people up to do the more creative work. But, it's the same argument where you say, well, truck drivers are going to be out of a job because we're going to have self-driving trucks. That frees them up to be something else. But what else are they going to be? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I buy that argument. But I think we're just scratching the surface of this. I don't think it's going to replace us, because remember, garbage in, garbage out. It's only working with what we as humans have given it to work with, and we have to keep giving it, I believe, that raw material in order to work with it. So the AI is able to do amazing things, but it can't do what a 10-year-old child can do, which is imagine.
That's a wonderful quote. I like that. I don't want to keep you for much longer, but I do have two more questions. And one is actually, it's been hanging here from the beginning when you said about our audience is probably going to be happier to hear from you than your students, which I struggle to believe, honestly. They must like what they have to hear. So that's kind of a bit of a not off topic, but not addressing entrepreneurs, but a lot of young people that are at that stage of their life where they're wondering what path to go on, are thinking about going into branding and marketing and consumer behavior. What would you say to those people? What is your feeling on that? How do you see that develop in the coming years.
So, would I advise my kids to become marketing majors? Is that what you're pretty much asking?
You're going to say no now. Don't say no.
I think that, what I like to say is, there's an old Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. That's a curse. And it's a curse that marketers are living with right now. We live in the most interesting time to be a marketer, but that word interesting works both ways. It's also a challenge. It creates a lot of obstacles. But I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time. It's hard to name a discipline where when you get up every morning, something has changed significantly. And I think, at least 3 or 4 days of the week, we could probably make that claim.
Absolutely.
And so who wouldn't want to be in a field that is so dynamic and also touches on so many important issues? The problem with marketing is that some people, unfortunately, they either view it as evil or as trivial. And, both of those, you could argue both of those, but I don't think both are correct, but I think they have some elements of correctness in them. But the fact is that if you're in marketing today, think about all the issues that you're touching upon. We've discussed a few, but sustainability, gender fluidity, social inequality, not to mention the joys of materialism. And, a lot of people still enjoy luxury products, and, that whole industry is changing. But with the technology that's coming out, when you're able to create a stock exchange for vintage sneakers, if I don't know if you're aware of that, but, that tells you you're in a time where the brands that we use have never been more important because they are part of the story that we're telling. And importantly, it's not the story that's coming to us top down from the corporate world. It's much more of a bottom up story where people are more proactively picking and choosing the brands that they use to represent themselves. So you made a comment earlier, which is totally correct. How could a brand that many thousands of people own be something that's distinctive to me? One answer to that is, what else are you buying with it? So in the old days, I think we were more likely just to passively almost buy, if you will, a suite of brands that were just kind of the mainstream brands that everybody used. But today you might find, your son might pair a pair of Levi's jeans, which everybody wears, but with a shirt that is only made by some guy in an alleyway, and then this vegan brand over here that's a star, but whatever that constellation of brands is, that's his identity. That's a big part of his identity. And the big change is how much more proactive people are in terms of choosing the brands that they want to represent them, rather than just passively accepting the market leader. So in that sense, being an entrepreneur is also the best time for that, because, when have we ever been in a position in our history where someone with only, one person can have the same impact as a big company with 100,000 employees by posting things on the net and on the web and so on.
Absolutely.
So, and by the way, it's also for women an unbelievable opportunity. I don't know how it is in Europe, but here in the States, I think something like 60% of marketing majors in universities are female. So it's definitely a field that's very friendly, I think, to gender equality and things.
Actually, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know how is it in Europe, but I mean, if you go back not even that far back, it was seen as a very male-dominated space, and I don't feel it's the case now. It is a very, and we touched on earlier that nowadays it's literally, I feel, a lot easier. Like if you are dreaming of changing the world, corporations and brands have like a bigger and quicker way of doing that than many governments even. And if you see marketing as that connection between a brand crafting and telling that story, but also we spoke about, it's a two-way street now. It's not just we're going to do that over here and present it to the world. It's like, no, we have to listen and take what people are saying and adapt that and incorporate it. And that connection is marketing, which I feel it's a very exciting place and time to be.
And that's, that goes back to what we were talking about before. I mean, the role of a brand today, like it or not, is to take stands and surveys have shown over the last few years, whether they're correct or not, people believe that corporations have more power to change the world than governments do, or other institutions like the church, et cetera. And so they're, rightly or wrongly, they're assigning a tremendous amount of responsibility to brands to not only, make something that, like a sneaker, like a shoe, but also at the same time to, end inequality or something. I mean, I'm not sure how realistic that is. Frankly, I think that governments need to take more responsibility and build more trust again. But when to me, one of the defining problems of our time is trust in institutions. And we know that, and this is, I think, even truer in Europe than it is in the United States, the level of trust in institutions to solve our problems is at an all-time low. And only brands can step in to fill the void, I guess. The problem with that is it's become a prerequisite. What's your social issue that you're taking a stand on? Well, I don't know. I make things for people to eat. I don't do that, but you have to, have to do that today. Yeah. And it's such an about face from everything we've learned about brands that they should not take a stand. They're for everyone who needs them. And we really need to give a lot more thought, I think, to what we're asking the brands to do. I personally think it's probably a bit unfair to put that much obligation on these brands, especially the ones that don't have a history of this, and in fact are probably the biggest perpetrators of some of these problems. Now all of a sudden we have to fix well, you created the problem, you fix the problem.
Absolutely. Maybe you should start working with governments, maybe on their marketing. That could be a good way.
Yeah, and of course, a government is a brand too.
Of course, yeah. I was thinking about it as you were saying. All right, last question. You have a book that came out recently, amongst other books, but that one in particular. Tell me a little bit more about it. Oh,
yeah, be happy to. The book, it unfortunately came out at the height of COVID, so it maybe got lost. But, the book is called The New Chameleons, How to Engage with Customers Who Defy Categorization. And so I use this metaphor of a chameleon, of course, is a lizard that changes its colors to depending on what's going on in the environment, for camouflage, et cetera. I'm not implying that customers are lizards by any means, but we also change frequently. What we change is our identity. We change the way we think about ourselves, who we want other people to think of us as. So as you go throughout your day, you're wearing different hats. Maybe you're a parent, you're a business owner, you're a football player. All of these different things. And those identities, of course, many of them are these politically charged ones, like your gender, ethnicity, income, et cetera. But that is, that's the currency that we're using today. And so what brands have to understand is that a lot of time, and I, mea culpa, I've been teaching students for 40 years about market segmentation, the importance of picking your lane, identifying a fairly large, homogeneous market. So for efficiency reasons, you send the same message to everybody. That's exactly what we don't want to be doing today. That was a technique that worked very well in the era of mass broadcasting back in the last century, literally. Today, it's all about personalization, customization, and what we actually call a market of one. So every individual consumer, in some ways is their own market. Whenever you get a personalized ad on Facebook or something, that there's an example of that. And so what I talk about in the book is basically in every chapter, I take on a basic dichotomy that we all take for granted and that marketers take for granted. And I show why it's no longer viable. Basic dichotomies such as, well, one we've already talked about, male versus female. So, if you're a marketer, you're either selling products for men or for women. Well, number one, today, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? There's a lot of controversy about that. So instead of a dichotomy, black or white, we have a lot of shades of gray. We have a continuum, and everybody's, I guess, finding their own place on that. Now, if you're a marketer, there's lots of interesting social issues there, but there's a lot of financial issues as well. So what's a quick example? Well, if I make women's accessories, let's say, I assume that men are off the table because I make a woman's product. However, as the male role gets redefined, just as the female role is being redefined in all sorts of ways, those barriers or those boundaries no longer hold up. And so increasingly, a lot of men are wearing, for example, here's one, a bracelet, right? So if I'm only selling to women, I'm essentially saying to half of the population, I don't make anything you want, go away. And so there are a lot of these assumptions that we make: rich versus poor, black versus white, old versus young. I'm talking about very basic classifications that we use to define our customer are largely obsolete because of many of these changes that are going on. So, old versus young, we have expressions like 80 is the new 60 and 60 is the new 40.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Which I totally believe in, but on the other hand, back in my day, we used to say never trust anyone over 30. And of course, your parents were public enemy number one. Today, one thing that, at least anecdotally, some retailers have told me is it's what they often see are that mothers and daughters shop together, that they're like best friends. That's become a thing, right? And mothers, and this trend about mothers and daughters dressing the same and so on. So if you think about it, that's a fundamental dichotomy from the 60s and 70s. You're either old, you're either young and cool, or old and not. Today, it's very hard to make those kinds of assignments. And so, so essentially, I'm going through the book and talking about those. And one of the most important ones, I think, directly relates to what we were discussing earlier, and that's the artificial boundary between producers and consumers. So our traditional assumption is that I make something, I'm not going to share it with you till it's absolutely perfect. And so you're the customer, you keep your distance from me. Today, we know that dichotomy has totally blown up. Everyday people are taking on other kinds of roles, like they're becoming taxi drivers, or they're running a hotel when they rent out their home as for an Airbnb. They may be sharing cars or power tools with their neighbors and things like that. Not to mention the millions of people in direct selling companies like Avon and Amway and so on, where everyday people are becoming entrepreneurs in that sense. So the reason it's so important is that, again, reaching out to your consumers, don't keep them at a distance. Apple is the most notorious for this. They will never, now and then someone will leak an image of the new iPhone. It's a big scandal. It shouldn't be a big scandal. People want to see it, and almost any other company would be happy to share it. So what most companies, Apple is the exception that proves the rule. I think that most companies, many companies, what they're doing now is they're trying to solicit a lot more input from their customers, which means that they're no longer just customers, they're co-creators. And if you think of, if you remove those old labels, don't say you're my customer, say you're my co-creator, that fundamentally changes the relationship that we have. And so I would summarize that by just saying it involves a change in a very, very simple word that has an unbelievable amount of implication. And that is, we've moved from marketing to the customer to marketing with the customer.
That's a good way to end this interview, and a very interesting one, because it kind of it makes me want to find out the rest in the book. And it's funny because it's like, as you're saying it, I'm like, that's obvious, but I haven't thought about it. So that's a great thing, and I think it will be very interesting and useful to our audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's been an absolute pleasure. We'll include a link to the write-up for the podcast for everyone who's interested in getting the book. I hope they can buy it online.
I'll send you the link.
Yeah, that works. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Smart Branding Podcast. Feel free to visit smartbranding.com for more information and reach out if you have any suggestions, questions, ideas, or just want to learn more about how a good domain name strategy can help you build a strong and successful brand. See you next time.